Well, welcome to episode 168 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and I'm back from my semi-annual research break, rested, tanned, fit, raring to go. And today I'm going to talk about an album by Richard Davis, which originally came out in 1972 under a different title, The Philosophy of the Spiritual, on Cobblestone Records, and it's re-released here on Muse Records, which is basically the same label, a few years later in 1975 as With Understanding. And actually, although this isn't the original one, I much prefer this because it's got a much cooler cover. What do we expect from this record? Well, Richard Davis is a remarkable, but strangely outside the jazz world, not particularly well-known bass player. He had an amazing career in hard bop, bebop, free jazz, and orchestral music, and he also played a number of quite well-known rock records. Now, given what the jazz world was like, you might imagine that somebody who was prone to crossover work might come under some, let's just say, critical scrutiny. But no, in fact, this guy won Downbeat's Critics' Poll for the Best Jazz Player for 8 consecutive years from 1967 through 1974. Davis is yet another jazz artist who also resists the categorization of jazz as its own special category of music. He considers jazz and classical music to be very similar, the only difference being that jazz is improvised while classical music is formally composed. Well, this is small group jazz. It's got elements of free jazz, spiritual jazz, modal jazz, classical, and even folk music, so it kind of defies categorization. But if you want to call it a jazz album, it's a brilliant jazz album. So Richard Davis, who's still going, by the way, at age 90, was born in 1930 in Chicago. He came from a musical family, and before he played bass, he actually sang bass with his two brothers in a vocal trio. His high school musical experience was extremely formative because he had an amazing high school teacher, a guy called Walter Diet, who is an absolute legend in the development of jazz and black music in Chicago in the middle part of the 20th century. As a high school level music teacher, he taught people like Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, Johnny Hartman, Bo Diddley, Clifford Jordan, Eddie Harris, and Johnny Griffin. And he's held in remarkable esteem in Chicago still. There's a high school, actually, a 4-year arts high school named after him. From Walter Diet, Davis learned how to play the double bass in 2 different ways, the bowed technique and also the pizzicato technique, or the plucking technique, which is so typical of jazz bass. He went on to develop a pretty serious musical pedigree. After high school, he studied with Rudolph Fassbender with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He studied at the Vandercook College of Music, and during this time, he also got some pretty significant exposure for a sort of major gig playing with Ahmad Jamal. In the early 1950s, he forms a musical partnership with the pianist Don Shirley, and together in 1954, they head off to New York to seek their fame and fortune. They perform together for a couple of years. Davis then moves on in 1956 to play with the Sauter Finnegan Orchestra, but his big break comes in 1957 when he joins Sarah Vaughan. This was his great apprenticeship, and he worked with her between 1957 and 1960. He learned the fine art of accompaniment, which of course has so much to do with listening as well as playing, and he became an excellent sideman and increasingly in demand. He calls this period the University of Sarah Vaughan, and he also got to learn at the same time from the other players in the group, including the piano player Jimmy Jones and the drummer Roy Haynes. By the early 1960s, Davis's talent is not in any doubt, and he's in increasing demand to play with all kinds of folks as a sideman. He plays with Jackie Bayard, Eric Dolphy, Sun Ra, Booker Ervin, Andrew Hill, Elvin Jones, and Cal Tjader. Of all these connections, probably the most profound one is with the saxophonist Eric Dolphy, and of course Davis is in the band for Dolphy's famous set of dates in the summer of 1961 at the 5 Spot. In the late 50s and early 1960s, people like Dolphy, Ornette Coleman, and others, all those players in the free jazz or so-called New Thing movement, really began to see free jazz as the musical articulation of the change they wanted to see in society. In other words, free jazz for black musicians was about freedom in more than one sense. On this topic, Davis himself at the time said that limiting yourself to a particular set of notes and chords is in a sense being a slave to the powers that be. This moment in time in Davis's career, and in particular his connection with Dolphy, was really magical. And nowhere is it probably better articulated than on Dolphy's famous album, his last release, Out to Lunch, where Davis's playing is nothing short of remarkable. Sadly, of course, Dolphy dies not long after that record comes out. He's playing in Berlin. He is a diabetic. He collapses on stage. The doctors at the hospital say, well, this guy's a jazz musician. Guess he just overdosed. And they just let him sleep it off. And of course, he died when he could easily have been saved. One of the great tragedies of jazz history. After Dolphy's death, Davis kept playing in the New Thing, but he also branched out into a number of different genres. In the 70s, he picked up quite a lot of rock work as a session guy, including Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, where he was basically the de facto band leader on the sessions. And he also plays on 2 albums by Springsteen, Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey, and Born to Run. This record comes out originally in '72, and it's one of the very first releases on Cobblestone, which was run by a guy called Joe Fields, who was an exec with Prestige Records for years and years and years. He'd also worked with Creed Taylor at Verve. But by 1972, he wanted to start his own label, Cobblestone, which he did, a subsidiary of Buddha Records, which of course was run by Neil Bogart, who would eventually run Casablanca Records. The record is produced by Larry Fallon, but really the other key person on the record, other than Davis, is a guy called Bill Lee, who also plays bass on here, and he does all the arrangements. Bill Lee has an interesting CV. Amongst the entries on it are the fact that he's Spike Lee's dad, although they're now estranged. He was an old friend of Richard Davis's from Chicago. He was a brilliant session guy all the way through the 1960s. He played on albums by Aretha Franklin, John Lee Hooker, Simon and Garfunkel, Gordon Lightfoot. One of these guys basically knew everybody. As a consequence, he was able to assemble a great cast of musicians for this, and he also did some incredibly sympathetic arrangements. This is Davis's favorite record of all the things he's produced because of the arrangements and because of the melodies and the way that Lee was able in the arrangements to really highlight Davis's particular and unique style of bass playing. The other players here are no slouches. They include Sonny Brown on drums, Sam Brown on guitar, Frankie Dunlop on percussion, and none other than Chick Corea is playing the piano. Side one starts with Dear Old Stockholm, which is a standard in Swedish circles, folk song, which Stan Getz had made more popular in jazz circles and had erroneously claimed credit for because it's actually a traditional composition. The beginning of this track is stunningly beautiful, with Brown's guitar and Corea's piano just floating around this rich backdrop of both basses playing. You always have Lee in one channel and Davis in the other on this record. Davis bows his bass all the way through. Lee varies between bowing and pizzicato depending on the tempo of the track. Eventually, despite the beautiful beginning, you get to this basically breakneck piece of hard bop. Then it slows down again for a very gentle outro. Just a stunning and really unique piece. The next song is Monica, which is composed by Bill Lee, and this starts off with Sam Brown's guitar. It's very delicate. It's got a bit of a Spanish texture. And then Davis's bass really begins to take over in the melody, and he's playing it quite high in the neck. It's almost cello-like. It's like you'd actually think it were a cello if you didn't know better. The final track is Oh My God, which is written by a person called Nadi Koma, about whom nothing can be found on the internet, and apparently this is the only writing or musical credit of any variety. So if you know any more about that person, please do leave a comment. You've got Lee plucking, you've got Davis bowing, you've got this eerie sound from Davis's flirtations with slightly off-key phrasings. There's a little bit of a scratching sound here which he affects, which reminds me actually a little bit of Pharoah Sanders, obviously a different instrument, but the same kind of feeling, same kind of mood. The track builds in intensity, both Davis's playing and also the accompaniment. The tempo picks up, driven by Corea and by Sonny Brown's drums, and then the band pauses, allowing Davis to basically help the song make this kind of stately exit. The song is dedicated to Eric Dolphy, and I think Dolphy would completely have appreciated this track. All three songs on side two are by Bill Lee. The first, The Rabbi, starts with this ascending bowed bass figure done by Davis, repeated octave by octave. Underneath that, you have a walking bass line from Lee, and out of all this comes kind of a riff on traditional Jewish music from Eastern Europe. Then Davis puts his bow away and starts plucking. His technique is remarkable, and large portions of the song are very reminiscent of, well, both Coltrane's, certainly late stage John and Alice, and also early stage Pharoah Sanders. Baby Sweets is a modal song. It's driven quite hard at the outset by Lee and Corea. You then have this charming little bass duet, and then it evolves into kind of a bluesy swing number, kind of sort of like edgy Stefan Grappelli. You get some more of that brilliant high register pizzicato playing from Davis, and then eventually it just becomes a flat out 12-bar blues. The last song is Juan Valdez, which is a title, is a bit of a jokey reference to the coffee marketing campaign. And true to form, this is a very Latin-sounding tune, complete with castanets, although, strangely, it's a bit more like Spanish Roma-sounding music than it is Latin American. Davis has all these great bowed flourishes in here, which are frequently interrupted by bits of Spanish guitar. The liner notes suggest that the band members figured that Juan Valdez wasn't just growing coffee on his Colombian hillside, but whatever your Colombian product of choice, this song is a great accompaniment. I've listened to a lot of jazz records, and the word unique is thrown around quite frequently, but this really is a unique record. It stands up to repeated listenings, and it always seems to offer something new. If you were to make any kind of critique, you'd say that Davis has got so many arrows in his quiver, so many different styles on which he can draw, and his musical knowledge is so vast that the movement from style to style runs the risk of having the record seem a little bit scattered. There's something to be said for restricting the number of approaches in any single track. But, that's kind of splitting hairs. The playing on here is amazing across the board, and every song is fascinating in its own way. It's a rich, rewarding, and very accessible listen. It's likely to appeal to fans of music from across a wide variety of genres, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.